Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation about the new experience economy. My name is Stephen Williams. I'm the Grants Director at the Edmonton Arts Council. I'm pleased to be here hosting this recorded session. Before we get started, I'm going to acknowledge that the Edmonton Arts Council, we live and work on traditional land here in Edmonton, which is also known as the territory of the Treaty 6 First Nations and the homelands of the Métis people. We recognize ourselves as treaty people and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries. And together, we call upon all of our collective traditions and spirits to work to make this a welcoming home for all peoples who come from around the world to share Edmonton. Also on the call with us today are Matthew Stone and Kim Griffin. They are here representing Stone-Olafson Research, who's been doing a bunch of work on behalf of a bunch of arts funders and other folks over the course of the pandemic. I understand Matthew and Kim are not on Treaty 6 territory today, but I will let them introduce themselves. They're going to walk us through some of the outcomes of the most recent set of research and interviews and data gathering that's been done through this project. So without further ado, Matthew, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thank you, Stephen. And Kim and I come to you from Treaty 7 land in Calgary. So we appreciate the opportunity to share these results with you. Thank you, everyone. Today, we're going to be covering off a few different topics. As Stephen had mentioned, this is the latest phase of research in an ongoing piece of work that we've been doing for help leaders of the experience economy get some relevant data. And if you've been following our presentations before, this one is going to be very tactical and very direct compared to ones that we've done in the past. We're going to cover off, remind everyone and think about, not that we need reminding, but some facts reminding us around the uncertainty that's arising from the medical and economic context that is just really reframing and changing how consumers are making decisions today. So that's going to be one point. The other point that we're going to be covering off is the continued importance of comfort and how the consumer mindset and how they're thinking and feeling is going to be just as important as some of the information that they need moving forward. Kim's also going to talk to us some more about shifting habits and identifying what people are actually doing now this spring and what are they willing to do. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit more about some how do you reach audiences in order to engage them and participate in the experience economy. At the end, we're happy to take questions and chat further about the research. So for those of you who have not participated in presentations before, there's a little bit of a history here, and we really appreciate some of the support from organizations that have been helping us through this. And we've developed a long-term study. This has been a journey that we started back in June of 2020. Excuse me. So we designed a longitudinal study, and the point here that we're trying to get to is we wanted to be able to talk to the same people over and over again for early in the pandemic so we could actually see how individuals were changing. But we've been continuing to track moving forward so that we can see how the population is also evolving as the conditions in the pandemic and the economic conditions outlying of that have also changed how organizations want to connect and how people want to engage with the experience economy. So that design means that we're going to be tracking some things. You're going to see some familiar data points that you've seen before. If you haven't, we have data going back to 8 phases of work, but we're also keep flexing and adjusting the design so that we can get current issues and new variables involved in the research and understand how they're affecting Albertans today. The sampling in the fall of the shifted from the fall in 2021. We started to focus last fall on Calgary and Edmonton exclusively. We may go back to doing province-wide, but a lot of the trends that we're seeing across Alberta are very similar in degrees that you would see in rural audiences. So if you're looking at this and you live in Fort McMurray or Red Deer or Lethbridge or Medicine Hat or wherever, you can know that by and large, the trends look very similar, though there are some slight differences for rural areas. This phase of work, we included 1,000 surveys. It's based on 1,000 surveys with 500 in both Edmonton and Calgary. So that gives us an overall reliability rate of about plus or minus 3% on the sample. Now, none of this work would be possible without the active support of these organizations. Stephen and team at the Edmonton Arts Council have been instrumental for the last 2 years in doing this work. We also want to thank our friends at Active City Collective here in Calgary in the Bow Valley Corridor, Calgary Arts Development, Explore Edmonton, and Tourism Calgary. The team here at Stone-Olafson is doing our best. We want to work with our partners collaboratively and bring some facts that you can use to the table. So thank you to each one of them. And if you're working with them, thank them because it's their generous support that makes this possible. So Let's start by talking about some of the changing contexts that I think are really about altering the calculus for how we're going to engage. 2 years ago, if I put this chart in front of you, you wouldn't have any clue what we're talking about. Sadly, today, we're all too familiar with what this means. And each successive peak that we go through and each successive valley that we enjoy, where lower case numbers, creates a new level of uncertainty. And you can see in almost every instance, things going up to most recently in January, February, where we saw 72,000 active cases. Such a height, actually, that we're no longer tracking them. These health conditions are reframing how people are thinking. And the tendency is that we think about it in terms of case numbers and hospitalizations. And yes, we're not tracking case numbers. We're now only looking at hospitalizations, which are still really high. We lose track of the fact that these are human conditions. These are people involved here. So if we think about some of the things that have happened early in the pandemic, we heard very quickly that these medical numbers are going to change values, and the pandemic is going to change how people think. Next slide, please. And then we can think about, but it isn't just about changing values, and this isn't about data. Data, number one, these are about people, not data points and not medical case numbers. And it's not about changing values so much, because that's not how values work. They take a long time. Now, if this stretches out for years, as many expect, we might be looking at that. But what we want you to watch moving forward and throughout this presentation and subsequent observance in the community is how habits are changing and how trends are accelerating. That's perhaps the most fundamental thing that's happened, is that those case numbers have influenced, accelerated certain trends that were already happening beforehand. So in the case of digital tools, it was already happening before the pandemic. All that happened is we raced very quickly to move to online support, and in some cases, substitutes. Doesn't mean that necessarily people are looking for substitutions now, but now we know that there has to be a digital component to lots of live experiences. We also know that there needs to be tons of flexibility in what we offer. The consumer is already looking for it beforehand. People talk about pandemic being the death of the subscription or membership model. That's not it. Case it was already happening. Instead, we need to offer things that the consumer gives the consumer maximum flexibility, be able to change their mind or change their habits or change what they're going to take in. Now, that doesn't mean it's the death of membership or subscription. It just means that you have to build that into them. We've also seen the pace of innovation and adaptation. Expectations for those things increase as well. Pre-pandemic, consumers used to tell us that the primary barriers for not attending or engaging with something was cost, followed closely by, it seems like it's the same thing I used to do. The idea that something was the same is probably one of the most fundamental barriers affecting attendance or engagement with experiences. And that continues to this day, because all organizations did during the pandemic was accelerate innovation. They accelerated how they and changed and adapted to how they engage with audiences. Consumers expect that even more now. And then finally, core priorities are changing a little bit, where yes, we've always have placed a high priority on wellness and family. Those are more active now because of the way health restrictions and case numbers are impacting our wellness and our family relationships. So at the end of the day, as you listen to the rest of the presentation and think about how you engage audiences, keep this in mind. Values aren't changing, they're just accelerating trends that before. So if you knew something was happening before, it's likely just accelerated today. Now, this is not just about case numbers. The other element in our context, and for the record, none of our research exists in a vacuum. We're looking at it through these lenses as well. And the economic factors are going to be absolutely critical. Alberta has a tenuous economic situation. We face economic conditions that are fairly unique in Canada and probably only one or two other jurisdictions across North America. And these economic variables are going to be very fundamental to how consumers engage moving forward. And it's a tough picture. Even in this most recent phase of research, we recorded that 37% of respondents tell us that they have experienced a sustained decrease in household income since the start of the pandemic. So that's just over a third of the market who has less coming in the door every month than they did before in terms of income. We see that consumer health debt levels right now have reached record highs at 186%. It took me a little while to figure out exactly what they're saying, but basically what it means is that for every dollar in disposable income consumers have, they owe $1.86 in average debt. That is a significant change. It's a record high, and this becomes especially important when you see talk about interest rates going up. So consumer debt is going to be more and more expensive to service. And then finally, we see unemployment remains high in Alberta as well at 5.9%. It's slightly higher than the national average. Now, you didn't come here for an economics lecture, but what is really important for you to take away is that Alberta is starting to look startlingly like the rest of the country. And that's a remarkable change for us because as a jurisdiction, and Edmonton and Calgary are very similar in this, we used to have exceptional status when it came to these economic factors, where we had large portion of our audiences who didn't have to factor in economic considerations. Now, at the same time as all of this, we all know the story about inflation in the last few months, and it's reached record highs. And things like food and energy and all items generally are being much more expensive. So these are variables that we have to think about, because incomes are going down or feel like they're going down, debt levels are going up, unemployment is more higher than we're used to, and things are getting much more expensive. What that means for you for thinking moving forward is that speaking to value and affordability, and they're not the same things, will be very, very important. And they're contexts that aren't just framing people's willingness to engage, but it's also framing their consideration, their interests, but also the types of experiences that they're going to want to have. And when I say value and affordability aren't the same thing, people can spend more and see value. You just need to show them the value. So these are considerations that haven't been a part of our conversation for the last until the pandemic, but now we're factoring them together between the medical and the economic. So what's the point? Yes, the medical side is obviously of the pandemic is ground shifting. Absolutely the case. That's not new. And those waves and valleys and peaks are creating uncertainty. And every time case numbers or hospitalization changes, people's mindset shifts a little bit. The economic variables cannot be ignored as well. So you have to think about that, and they're very far reaching. They're going to take a while to resolve themselves. But now what? What should you be thinking about? Well, because of the medical issues, audiences have been adapting. The health restrictions changed how people could engage, so they adapted. And organizations adapted quite well as well. This has created a trend of accelerated innovation that the consumer audiences continue to expect. Recently, I was talking to somebody from Edmonton, and they said, this isn't about going back to normal. This is a fresh start. So in many ways, think about this fresh start, not as a restart. Finally, you have to recognize that adaptation and innovation have to take the weaker spending power into account. Consumer audiences just has fewer dollars to spend and are more tenuous in their willingness to spend. And you'll see this in their attitudes when Kim talks a little bit more about how they're deciding. So we talked for many months and years now about comfort and how this is a variable we all have to think about. And pre-pandemic, consumers followed that relatively predictable pattern. You could choose a pyramid or a cycle or whatever relevant marketing lingo came up, but really we had the same things to deal with. Were consumers aware? Did they do their research? We had to drive consideration, the promise of experience to get them to make a decision, and then they evaluate their experience, and then the cycle starts all over again. And today, however, we have to consider the comfort of the audience. They'll do their awareness, they'll do their research, and we can drive all the consideration we want. But if they're not comfortable in a room full of strangers, they're not going to engage. And that's changing the game. So where are we on comfort right now? As you may know, we ask comfort in a very simple way. On a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you? Where 1 means I'm only comfortable with my immediate family, and 10 means I'm entirely comfortable, I'm ready to go with people in close proximity. And what we're seeing in Edmonton, about 29% are high comfort audiences. That's slightly lower than Calgary, and that's been consistent trend through the pandemic. And that's because the audience has had different experiences with COVID over the last 2 years. At the other end of the scale, we know that 16% of the market in Edmonton has low comfort. They're going to be very reluctant to engage in anything that isn't just singular or on their own entirely protected. In the middle, we see the bulk of our market overall, about 2/3 in Edmonton, who are comfortable with their own social groups. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to engage in events that have other people there. It just means they're less comfortable doing it. But it also means that their priority is to be with the ones that they want to be with, so the people that they know in their social circle. Now, this has been changing for the last 2 years over time. The gray lines represent all the previous phases of work. And if we showed you only October 2020 and December 2020, you would see high discomfort at the other end, only being willing to isolate with their family and their immediate family only, and very low comfort at the other end. But over time, as case numbers have varied and vaccination rates have gone up, and more good news stories have emerged in the media, we see comfort slowly increasing. But the fact is that the bulk of our market is still in that median comfort zone. So there's very, very reluctant and tenuous. Now you're going to hear a lot about in the market about pent-up demand. And even during the recent run of the Oilers in town, you see bar owners talking about crowds coming back. That isn't the whole market. Keep in mind, in any mass event you go to, whether it's in the arts and culture sector or otherwise, we're not seeing the whole population represented. We're seeing the population of the comfortable participating. Now, part of that mindset is not just comfort, it's also going to be their emotional mindset. And this is absolutely fundamental to purchase decisions going back forever, really. We need to have consumers in a certain mindset to get them to engage. And the more positive they are, the more likely they are to spend. But when you think about those contexts we talked about at the very beginning, uncertain health numbers, tenuous economic conditions, it's not surprising that we see large portions of the audience who are feeling stressed, exhausted, worried, frustrated. Now, things like frustration, it's really important to note, have changed because early in October of last fall, 2/3 of the market was frustrated and 51% were exhausted. So there's some positive movement. Annoyance has gone down by half, and but perceptions of feeling isolated still there. We still see some other things like 36% the market is, or 38% is hopeful, wasn't really registering in the fall before. Grateful at 25%, slowly edging up. Encouraged, 16%, didn't really register. So there's some positives, but for the most part, consumers are feeling quite tenuous and a little bit reserved. And this is something that we have to keep in mind as we engage with them moving forward, whether it's in our programming or in our marketing. Now, their attitudes follow a very similar pattern. And some of these attitudes we've been tracking over time. We see that 75% of the audience is eager to get back to the shows they used to visit. That's a great news story, but we'll caution that by showing that only 22% completely agree. So we've got about a quarter of the market who are just eager to get back. They're convinced those are their most active that we're going to see in events. We know that there's a similar proportion who find themselves less patient, but this is the downside. They're less patient for when they see people in public who may look like they have a seasonal flu and they're still participating. So the market has changed in the sense that I don't really want to be around those people, and that's contributing to that sense of discomfort. We have 2/3 who they can't wait to explore, but that's going to be offset by that 69% who said, I've become wary of large crowds since the pandemic. And we have 67% who are still on the sidelines. So at the end of the day, you have to take these emotional mindset, these emotional factors into consideration. We can't ignore them. The market's still in a bad mood. And even if restrictions are off, it doesn't mean that consumers are just going to rebound. We saw this in the summer of 2020. We saw this last summer, and it's going to take a while for people to get back. The big thing that we really you have to think about is to what degree your programs taking the end messaging, both taking these into account. This isn't going to be, Kim's going to talk a little bit about this in a bit, but this isn't about just your messaging talking about one thing. It's also be about what's actually being offered that people can experience. The other thing is that your innovations, do they encourage or inhibit engagement based on where the market's at? We hear a lot about pent-up demand, pent-up demand, pent-up demand, but as Kim's going to show you, that's not necessarily the case. Intent is very positive, but action is a bit more tentative. That means you're going to have to focus naturally on the positive, the escape, and the fun and wellness to offset people's levels of comfort and their varying emotional concepts. Kim?
Great. Thank you, Matt. So what I'd like to do now is, now that we have a really good understanding of consumer mindset right now, and they acknowledge that it is forever shifting. So this work was done in late March, early April, and we are in May moving into June, and it's likely shifted again. Having said that, it's really helpful as always to understand what audiences are actually doing and what they're motivated to do, so we can build our programming and our messaging around that. So as a basic step, we wanted to take a look at some of the activities that Albertans, and particularly here today, Edmontonians, are doing right now. And so these are things, activities, events, experiences that audiences have been enjoying in the last few weeks. So not surprisingly, almost everyone is streaming content of some sort, at least on a fairly regular basis. And you can look at the list and you can kind of see where engagement is starting to go. So 51% have said they've been shopping at a mall. 36% have traveled somewhere within Alberta, and the list really goes down from there. The thing to note, and while we're not showing it here today, is that this list, if it were asked 2 years ago, would look drastically different. And all I mean by that is the numbers would be a lot higher. So it's really positive to see that audiences in some respects are returning to these activities. But if we were to compare this to pre-pandemic levels, participation is still considerably lower. As an example, if you net those travel items in the kind of third, fourth, fifth line items there, about 45, 47% of Edmontonians have done some sort of travel. Pre-pandemic, that was 90%. So of course, we all know people, and perhaps ourselves, have been eager to travel to different places. I probably know so many people myself who have kind of done that 2020 trip, done it over. However, on a regular basis, travel is still down. International travel pre-pandemic was 51% on a regular basis. It's reported down to 7% now. So these are just examples of things that take some time to really come back in a real way. So it's encouraging, but we're not yet there yet across the board. When we look at specific arts and culture experiences, the story is still the same. So audiences really are still engaging primarily in smaller or less formal activities that right now than they might have been previously. So the idea that people are spending time creating personally, this is really something that's kind of been bolstered throughout the pandemic as people look to discover new hobbies and activities. But to see that at the top of the list, things with similar with libraries or perhaps outdoor festivals, those make sense. But again, these numbers would be a lot higher pre-pandemic. And so that's the first thing, is to note, Matthew talked about the idea that in some cases you see audiences raring to go, and in other cases the audience just isn't quite there yet. And I think that helps explain, I'm sure there's a lot of people that will be viewing this that think, well, wait a second, bar and restaurant owners, and you look at the Oilers games and it's packed, and so where are my customers? And the reality is not all audiences are created the same. The pie is not equal, right? So some audiences are more primed, others, and in a lot of cases, this is arts and culture experiences, are a little bit more hesitant. So what you can do as a starting point is understand that. The other thing is to remind yourself what really motivates engagement. It's not changing drastically from what we knew about motivations pre-pandemic. Having a fun experience, socializing, these were always some key and top motivations. And these haven't really changed, but there are some nuances. So audiences right now are still looking for that experience, a fun experience. It's a little bit different, as they are looking for a bit of a unique experience. And this really is a kind of an emerging trend from the pandemic again, where we were forced to explore new and different activities. So it kind of whet our appetite a little bit to see what else is out there. That means, again, the competitive landscape's changing. So audiences might be looking for something a little bit different. Socialization as a motivation is still there, but really audiences are looking about sharing with their friends and families. So it's more about being with the people you love and the people you want to be with than mingling and meeting new people outside of your circle. And then the other key motivation to keep in mind is this increased importance on health and learning and perhaps wellness. This has really emerged in a much stronger way throughout the pandemic. So organizations can kind of get a sense of what audiences are doing right now, but then go back to what's motivating audiences in the first place. And that's going to be really helpful to grow engagement. Now, the other thing, and this really just builds on the point that I was saying, is not all audiences are going back to what they used to. So we collectively I just looked at what audiences are doing now. We followed this question up with trying to understand, well, what are you doing now that you, or what are you not doing now that you maybe were before the pandemic started? And collectively, there's about 24% of the market that is no longer engaging in arts and cultural experiences, but they were before the pandemic. So when you think about perhaps ticket sales or audiences in bums and seats, know that there is a portion of that market that is, for a number of reasons, not with you right now. So then the question is, why? Well, first of all, we know that indoor experiences, large crowds, all those things that are a little less shareable are the ones that seem to be dropping off a little bit more than those smaller group activities or things that are more self-directed. And the primary reasons for this really hinge on two elements: finances or comfort. This goes right back to the pieces that Matthew was discussing right at the beginning. So if we look at the top barriers for Edmontonians, low comfort being in a crowd, 48%. Cost is too high, 43%. Cost has always been a bit of a default for folks to fall back on if they're not necessarily certain why they don't want to engage in an activity, there will be some of that, but certainly what we know about with the tenuous economic conditions right now, that this is a real consideration and barrier for a lot of audiences. But if you really look at those top four mentions, it's about lower comfort in a crowd, high cost, lower comfort with other people, or a change in income, so affordability. So again, finance and comfort. And there's a couple other elements that come up. There's a hesitancy to commit. We'll talk about that in a minute. The emergence of other activities and hobbies. So there's a lot of factors in play here. But if you had to isolate really the most impactful, it's finance and comfort. And to build on that, organizations are probably feeling this pinch, but now we have the data to help understand it, that the shifting purchases and purchase habits are causing some anxiety or habit for organizations. So 85% of the Edmonton market has told us that they'd rather do one-time events or single activities than a subscription or a membership model. So that is really significant. And as Matt noted, there has been a tendency, a move towards this for some time now. And those of you in organizations where you have a subscription model will probably recognize this, that it's been a challenge for some time pre-pandemic, but the pandemic has only accelerated that. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? It's just a less attractive option in its current form for many than it maybe once was, where you're kind of committed to something and for a number of reasons. The other thing I think is important to note on this slide is the 48% who say, I've moved on from previous activities. I found things I don't think can be interrupted by the pandemic. Now that's softened a little bit since the fall, but again, it really highlights this kind of need for the market to look for things where they're not stuck, where they're not committed, because there's a hesitation about cancellations or perhaps being sick or any number of things. And again, just one more point to reiterate that is the 41% that say because of this pandemic, I've been a bit more spontaneous. So what we're seeing is a tendency for audiences to purchase tickets or book experiences much later than they might have used to, right? So the planning cycle has also shifted, which can be really disruptive for organizations when you're doing your own planning. So what does this mean? Well, we know audiences are starting to return to activities. We know that venues and events and activities are starting up much more so than they even were 6 months or a year ago. But there's so much new context around in the market, and this shapes what audiences are actually doing. So we know that some activities are dropping off, and there's a lot of external contexts that remain that are shaping those how comfort sits and what value looks like. So how do you manage this? Well, the first step, again, is partly recognizing the audience that you used to have may not be the one that is going to come back to you in its same form. It may look different. When you think about your messages, value and safety are going to be messages that you're going to have to consider. I'll talk a little bit more about that in depth. But be mindful of changing purchase habits and changing decision-making processes when you do your planning. So Matthew mentioned a restart, a fresh start, not a restart. That means that it's not just we're pressing the button, we're going back to normal or what we used to do. And I think we all know that in some way, shape, or form, but to see how audience habits and consumer trends are reshaping how things are done in real time is much different than kind of having a sense that this is different. So then let's dive in a little bit more into how these habits are shifting. The first thing I want to start off with is it's a bit of a sidebar, but many of you are going to be planning your productions and your content. And so one of the things that we wanted to understand from audiences is content. What type of performances are going to be most compelling or encourage you to attend? And I don't know if this is surprising to anyone, but if you look collectively at this list, it's about the lighthearted, over the epic, or the thought-provoking. And it's not to say that that type of content does not have a place. But right now, if we go back to the consumer mindset and the emotional mindset of audiences, frustrated, stressed, exhausted, we need a little levity. So will make me laugh is unique, will make me excited, discover something new that hinges on that desire for something a bit unique. Those are all really preferred types of performances. So just give this some thought and consideration when you're building towards your audiences. Now, going back to that purchase decision-making journey, as we touched on, more and more consumers are delaying that purchase decision and making ticket purchases or planning for events much, much later than they would used to. And the question is why? Well, 43% of Edmontonians say in case something else comes up that I'd rather do. Now, that's a bit of a hard one to peg, but if you think about it and just how our landscape of options has changed, it starts to make a lot more sense. We are seeing activities and events maybe popping up in different timing than we're used to. We're also we're not used to having kind of a set schedule of things available to us. So there's a little bit of exploration that's happening. But below that, the next pieces again come back to comfort a little bit and also finances. Worried about cancellations, worried about getting sick before the event. Those are really about, there's a lot of hesitancy in the market related to this. I would suggest that this notion about worried about cancellations might be softening in some form, but we were just having a sidebar conversation about there are productions out there that are forced to delay a show or delay a production simply because those involved fall sick. I mean, there's simply nothing you can do about that, but it certainly wreaks havoc with planning, and it makes sense that audiences are a bit nervous about that. And the opposite is really the audience itself, right? I hate to buy a ticket because what if somebody in my circle gets sick? The other thing to note is, anecdotally, probably many of you know people that are planning a big event or a big travel trip. And so the lead up to that is almost fraught with worry about getting sick or getting other people sick. So you kind of buckle down, or at least some groups of the market are doing that. So again, you can start to understand why consumers are delaying purchase decisions, because there's a lot of factors in play. A lot of it is also just habit and affordability as well. So the question then becomes, well, what can you do to help consider or encourage earlier engagement? So those top elements, flexible refund cancellation policies and knowing I can cancel, get my money back, are really important. I think this is something that audiences were clamoring for at the beginning of the pandemic. It was an issue for some organizations who just didn't simply have policies in place, and whole productions or whole events had to be canceled or shut down. Now that things are back up and running, I just showed you some of the emerging or the still existing concerns about cancellations or worried about getting sick yourself. So again, audiences need to know that if they're going to put their money down or they're going to plan to attend something, that there's some mechanism in place that they feel secure with that decision. And something as simple as flexible refund or cancellation policies is really, really important. And it may not be possible in all for all activities, but I think it's something some organizations have gone away from and said, well, we're back, so it's business as usual, you're in or you're out. And that may not be working for everybody. Of course, there's early bird discounts or any sort of value play. You're always going to get people to stand up and take notice with that. And it's not to say that you discount everything, but be mindful of the fact that affordability and value are still really important. There's a third of the market, 33%, who say just knowing the pandemic's truly over. And so again, that reflects that really low comfort group. And so it's going to take time for some of these audiences simply to come back and to be ready to engage. And then the next step in this is, what do you have to talk about to drive increased consideration to come to our experiences? So some of this is as much of the same. Value offers, of course, that always drives a bit more notice. Safety. And so we talked about value and safety messages, right, to combat those financial and comfort concerns. Now, there's a portion of the market, 41%, who have said, I just want to know about the event. Just tell me where to show up, the dates, hours of operations. Part of that is because we've spent so much of the last couple of years trying to understand what is safe and what's available, that the details have been lost. So sometimes just being transparent about when and where is really helpful. What I want to point out, though, is that value and safety, those are those top mentions, but a lot of audiences are also tired of hearing these over and over and over in the pandemic. So we're not suggesting that you just hammer audiences with these two messages. The other element, you'll see this 39% say just, I want to know about the artist or the show being performed. So value and safety need to be built into your planning in some respects, but then you have a lot more freedom to talk about the content or the event itself. So we asked a similar question just in words of the audiences themselves? What will finalize your intention to participate in an experience? And you can see that COVID and safety related messages, 32% are still important, but it's about the subject matter, the content that's reflecting interest and motivations more directly than safety. So yes, safety, yes, value, but weave that into your planning. And you can still lead in a lot of cases with subject matter, so you can get to those motivations of your audiences. Now, we're all tired of seeing information or data that talks about what sources do you use, because it often does look the same, but it's important to just remind ourselves that word of mouth is still the largest source of information for a lot of activities. 63% are still looking to friends, families, neighbors to find out what's going on and the activities that they want to participate in. So the information that you provide needs to be really shareable. If you don't have a direct channel to an audience and you are perhaps going to reach different audiences, make sure it's shareable. Social media influencers do play a really big role as well, 40% here, and that is higher among that particular age group. So let's not neglect that. And I think a lot of organizations are doing a good job of using this. Don't neglect traditional sources either, a general media or hearing directly from the organization. However, I think the takeaway here is that social media, friends and family, word of mouth really do have a lot of pull right now. All right, so what I want to leave you with from here is that what we know is that people need to hear, or what people need to hear is really complex. We keep hearing safety value, I need to hear about, and that addresses that financial aspect and that comfort aspect. But that's not all they need to hear. So I would hate for everyone to take away from this is that those are your only two messages. They still need promises about the experience that really line up with their motivations for doing an experience. So talking about the event itself, the content, framing it in ways that match the motivations of your audiences is going to be really key. And what you can do here is just remember that the mindset of your audience, remember what they're thinking when you shape your strategy. Build in those safety and those value messages as table stakes, but remember that they're not the full story. It's about aligning the motivations. That's going to be really key to finalizing audiences' intent to partake in your experience. So we'll leave you with a couple final thoughts for today based on what we've talked about. The first one is that mindsets, habits have changed. In some ways, if you've been following us over the course of the last 2 years, we've been saying this over and over again, but it bears repeating. Organizations need to adapt. If you haven't started to adapt, you need to start now. Audiences expect innovation and adaptation, not just in messaging, but in their programming as well. It's a built-in expectation for audiences, and organizations do need to heed this. And then in some ways, this is disheartening to some organizations, but the reality is this uncertainty that we've come across is simply not going to dissipate anytime soon. We know, and we have known this for some time, that consumers and audiences are really eager to get going. They've told us as much, but they're much more tentative in their behavior. And I think this bears out when we think about some of the data that was coming out in late 2020 or early 2021. People were saying, yes, I'm ready to go. As soon as the doors open, I'm there. And for a lot of organizations, that didn't materialize. And it's not some fundamental flaw in your operations. It's just that the same approaches pre-pandemic simply don't work in the same way just because restrictions have lifted. So acknowledging that and planning for that uncertainty is going to be real key.
You know, we're operating in a total period of uncertainty. It's a bit like we're in the eye of a storm. And I think one of the things that's really, really critical to think about ongoing is the why. Why organization exists, why audiences are with us, why are we offering any of the experiences we're offering? Because that can be the North Star for organizations as they move forward. If you have a fundamental understanding of why you're there, and why your consumers are there, you can align those two things. That can build up a lot, even when you're reaching new audiences. So make sure as an organization that you have clarity on that, because that'll guide you and steer some of the reconnections that you're going to be creating and help you reach new audiences that you may not have been able to reach before. And then the last point is, don't be afraid to act nimbly and be ready to test. I think this is one of the things that is easy to say and hard to action on. We get it, but organizations need to think a bit about this, is say, listen, we need to be prepared to try stuff, small things, adapt. If it doesn't work, abandon it. Don't worry about sticking with something because you want to give it a second chance. If it doesn't succeed, move on quickly to the next thing. And there can be easy ways to do this kind of test. It can be either in real time or in testing ahead of time through a cycle development. So with that, some final thoughts. Thank you very much, Stephen, for hosting us and allowing us to share these ideas. Are there any questions?
Sure. It sounds like somebody's got a fire alarm going on.
Yeah, they're testing fire systems. I'll get him to mute. It's probably less loud there.
I think
Oh, it stopped.
I-
It stopped.
if somebody else wants to offer a question, I'll certainly pause for a second to see if any come up. But I will start with I noted that on one of your middle slides, you talked about 24% of consumers weren't planning to come back to arts and culture events, which is sort of a terrifying number in some ways. I wonder if your research has aligned that. Did you ask similar questions of other intent, sports or tourism or other things, and that whether or not that's the same number or a different number for those things?
Can I start off, Matt, and then you can build on that?
Please do.
I'll add a point of clarification. There's, as you know, Stephen, a very detailed report that accompanies this, and that was a bit of an average. The question is not never going to come back, but no longer doing right now. So I say that to provide, some optimism and hope. They've simply put that on the back burner for a variety of reasons. And it varies, of course, by types of arts and culture experiences. Right now, the largest portion who say they're no longer doing something tends to be live performances, right? So festivals and museums and those types of things have a little bit more uptake. We did ask this for active experiences as well, and I believe the proportion is similar. I believe that group or that set of activities has a little higher return rate, I guess. But there is a similar proportion, about 21% of that market, if I remember correctly, who are also pulling back from those activities.
Yeah, there's no mistaking the fact that the market, regardless of vertical within the experience economy, has seen a decrease, and the pie has gotten a little bit smaller just because of that comfort, and now because of value or affordability. However, there are trends that do show up. Indoor experiences, those with large crowds that are a bit more closer proximity, are ones that are dropping off regardless of verticals. It just so happens that in the arts and culture sector in particular, we see more frequency of those types of activities versus outside, outdoors, self-directed. So for example, Stephen, we're seeing lots more of the community still engaging with the arts, but they're doing it in a creation format or observing, listening digitally, but they may not be attending in person to the same degree they did before. So if you're able, I think the takeaway for organizations is if you're able to adapt your programming to be outside, and the easy one that I can point to is the theater companies who do Shakespeare in the Park, a really simple example, but they adapt easily to an outdoor environment, easier, more comfortable, people can spread out. Those kinds of adaptations are simplistic, but they give you an indication of what people are thinking about as well.
And maybe you've kind of alluded to the fact that there's a deeper report attached to all of this information. And that includes things that I certainly had some questions about, like demographic differences, because of course, some of the organizations that are going to listen in on this presentation have specific demographics that they're interested in serving or attracting. If somebody wanted to get more information, where could they find it? And if they needed to talk to you, first of all, what other information might they go looking for? Where would they find it? And if they had questions, how would they find you?
Great question. Kim, can you bring up the last slide one more time? So we have a QR code. If you have a cell phone, you can scan it. Otherwise, you can just go to our website, www.stone-olafson.com. And all of the information that we have available is free of charge. So all the detailed breakouts of the detailed reports, this is just a presentation version. So there's a few more things that we're not showing you that are less exciting right now, but still valuable. But we also have the detailed data tables available as well, if you want to look at those. If you want, all of our contact information is there. And if that information is can't be found, by all means, we encourage you to contact your friends at Edmonton Arts Council. They will direct you, and we are more than happy to answer any questions, even if you wanted to have a conversation saying we're thinking about or what if, those kinds of considerations. We're happy to have those kind of discussions back and forth.
Fantastic, thank you. Did you have any other last things to say?
No, I think at this point, thanks. We hope that it's useful, but also that we're going to stay tuned, keep your eye out. We're going to be hopefully doing more of these later in the summer or in the fall, and hopefully be able to continue. We're always happy. If there's one last thing I will ask, is if you're watching this and you have an idea of things that you would find particularly valuable, email us. We would love to be able to know that kind of feedback because it helps us better tailor some of the research that might happen in the future. So we're always open to new ideas, exploring other things.
Fabulous. Well, on behalf of the Edmonton Arts Council and our other friends in the consortium that helped pay for all this at Explore Edmonton and other places, thank you so much, Matthew and Kim, for taking the time to give us this presentation today. And we'll look forward to the next time as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.